Alright y'all, I've been working on a Shadow Bloodwave build. The Shadow Surfer is a build that I've been saying I would put together for a very long time. It's worked in previous seasons, a bunch of people have played this build. You get to put together Ultimate Shadow with Bloodwave, and then that makes it apply this massive damage over time effect that you can put on your two-hander for the biggest total bonus. And then you add on things like Desecrated Ground damage, which rolls very high because it's very niche. You also get to use the Desecrated Glyph, which gets you a huge amount of additive damage here, etc., etc. And the ultimate effect is very cool looking. Honestly, the build does feel very good to pilot. You have the title to summon multiple blood waves over time. Then you go and you pick up all these blood orbs, and as long as you have enough cooldown reduction, you can immediately recast it, etc., etc. The build feels good. I very much like the build. I'm having a fun time with it. But while playing this build, I got asked a lot of questions about the viability of different builds, why I kept comparing it to our core skills as well, and I wanted to use this as an opportunity to highlight an issue that I tried to bring up in my Sever video. I'll go ahead and link that there. It's a longer one, but it goes over all of the issues of Sever as a core build and as a core skill for a Darkness Necromancer, and why I think it's generally pretty bad. But not only that, it's that basically every core skill, other than Bone Spirit, just feels bad this season. And I wanted to try to make a video to highlight this in some meaningful way, and I'm going to use Shadow Bloodwave as a great example of something that is not a core skill, and as such can actually scale to do enough damage to feel good running in the pit. Now, if you're playing something like Bone Spear, can you get up into pit like 100, 110? Sure. You absolutely can do this thing. It's going to be very hard. The gear requirements are exceptionally high. But when we're talking about pit tier 100, pit tier 110, while that's still absolutely the benchmark for a lot of different people, and I personally think that if your build can do that, you're doing just fine. But when we talk about scalability, the ability to actually output enough damage to even kill pit tier bosses, regardless of survival, like let's just take survival off the table in its entirety. But when we start talking about scalability of damage, I want to use this as an example to just try to highlight the major issue with scaling damage right now, and the fact that unless we get a pretty massive overhaul or access to new damage types, the core skills on the Necromancer are all effectively trash. And I hate being that dismissive, but I really mean it, and I just want to use this as an example. Let's start off with Bloodwave itself. Let's just very quickly look at how much damage does Bloodwave do when I throw it at this training dummy? Because we can't really scale its damage via the skill itself, right? None of the things in our skill tree will work with the fact that it is also a blood skill. So Coalesce Blood doesn't increase the damage from Ultimate Shadow, etc. You have to use Gloom, you have to use Terror, you have to use Shadow Blight for the scaling, and that's perfectly fine. But the reason why I bring that up is because you can only scale very specifically the Desecrated Ground damage of this ability, as opposed to like adding skill ranks or putting on a Shaco won't increase its damage. That's kind of what I'm getting at here. But let's go ahead and just toss it at this little training dummy and see how much damage it does. Alrighty, so we're doing 5.8 million damage when we crit on Wither, and we're doing about 1.6 when we don't. So I'll just write that down, 1.6 and 5.8. Not bad at all. That is actually very impressive. Well, not really impressive. 5 million damage might sound like a lot, but considering the Blight build currently maxes out around like 1 to 1.5 billion damage per tick, we have a couple factors of 10 here before we're really going to start doing impressive damage. But keep in mind, this is a pretty well built out build, right? So we have a massive two-handed weapon with a greater affix on intelligence. We're double dipping on all of our damage procs because those double dip for damage over time. We have a maximum strength aspect here. It's doing 282,000 base damage over 4 seconds. Look at all of our gear. We have more greater affix intelligence, more damage over time, rolls of Desecrated Ground across everything other than this one damage to close, RIP to me. We have more ultimate cooldown, more Desecrated Ground, more intelligence. I have an intelligence percentage amulet, more damage, more ability to apply vulnerable. Everything here is built towards making Desecrated Ground do as much damage as possible. And it does a pretty sizable amount of damage. No issue there. Now, what if I were to take this very similar gear, right, which obviously is not going to have enough damage over time and stuff like that. But if I were to take this very similar gear and try to show you the damage that Corpse Explosion could do. We have relevant stats in all of our Paragon. We have relevant stats in our skill tree. Let's go ahead and put on a ton of Corpse Explosion gear, right? So we have a double masterworked Black River, it hit for intelligence, it has +4 to corpse skills, it's only a 128 damage multiplier as opposed to a 130, but we can put on greater affix corpse explosion here, put on more corpse skills on our boots. Obviously, we have to swap over to a big old focus to have the most damage possible. And I have put in every skill rank that I can. While you could definitely get more than 19 ranks to corpse explosion, this is a lot. This is a lot of investment. I think that plus 14 skill ranks is like pretty decent. You know, we're showing 193,000 damage over 6 seconds. Obviously, tooltips should not be fully trusted, and that's another part of kind of why I'm making this video. But tooltip currently says 193,000 damage over time. Let me go ahead and make 5 corpses, and then let's cast Corpse Explosion, see how much this bad boy does. Alrighty, so I have 5 corpses over there. I'm going to eat 5 corpses, which is going to give my Corpse Explosion, what is it? It is 4 less. So it is going to be a 6 times damage multiplier, a little bit more than a 6 times damage multiplier. On top of Corpse Explosion's damage, we have rank 19 in the skill. Huge amount of damage. Let me go ahead and cast this, and we do a whopping 64,000 damage with a Wither crit of 169,000 damage. Well, obviously you can spam cast Corpse Explosion, right? Like you could have multiple of these going, but even if I had 5 times as many on top of this training dummy right now, 5 corpse consumption, so 25 corpses in total, I'd be doing a whopping, what is that? 250,000 up to just under 900,000 damage for eating 25 corpses and casting Corpse Explosion 5 times. Now, a lot of people don't realize that Corpse Explosion's skill ability right now is absolutely hot garbage trash. It's so bad. It's so wildly bad. But I hear you. Mac, you're wearing a bunch of desecrated ground gear. You have a bunch of stats that, while they all work for Corpse Explosion, you're missing out on so much additive damage, even though I still have a ton of intelligence on the build, and even though I still have greater affix intelligence, and even though I have masterwork on the gear that I would normally use for this. You don't have enough additive damage on it. That's the problem. You're missing out on additive damage. Sure, absolutely, no question. I hear you. I could optimize for this. Let's run a different experiment. So again, just to kind of remind you how much damage we dealt, we did 50,000 damage up to about 160,000 damage with a single 5 corpse explosion. Well, let's use another skill as an example, right? Like let's use some alternative here that is equally not being empowered and also isn't benefiting from all the desecrated ground and all of that. Let's use Blight, and let's use Ebonpiercer. So right now, other than the Shaco that I'm currently wearing, granting me 4 ranks to this skill, I don't have any other points in it. I'm not currently using things like Imperfectly Balanced. I'm not doing any of that. I'm just going to cast Blight into this target dummy. Now let's see how much damage it does when all 4 of the Ebonpiercer bolts hit it simultaneously. That is doing 1.2 million damage on a crit from Wither, and about 400,000 damage from everything else. 400,000 damage for casting Blight 1 time. No corpse requirements, no big 6 times multiplier from Black River. Nope. Cast Blight 1 time, and I'm now Wither critting for 1.2 million damage. Now, do you remember how much damage we were doing with Ultimate Shadow on Bloodwave? Well, it was 1.6 million to 5.8 million. That was on top of the fact that we also had Tidal applying 3 blood waves, although hilariously enough, Tidal applying 3 blood waves actually doesn't triple your damage. This has been a known bug for a while. I think it has to deal with the way that Desecrated Ground works. It applies a debuff if the target touches Desecrated Ground, but it doesn't apply stacking debuffs. But the reason why I bring up the Tidal aspect here is it does increase the overall length that we're doing damage to the target. So let's use this exact same example. Let's just cast Blight 3 times into the target. Again, with no investment in its damage at all, just Ebonpiercer on. 1, 2, 3. And I'm now doing base 1.6 to Wither critting for 4.7 million damage. With just Ebonpiercer on, and nothing else. Now, I'd like to bring us over to a data sheet, just to very quickly show you a very, very rough, very inaccurate, but it's going to paint the picture that I think is very important, estimation of damage output. Because I think a lot of people are necessarily missing how the various damage over time effects work, the fact that they tick twice per second, the fact that they all have different lengths. So Ebonpiercer applies its damage over 3 seconds. So even though it's a smaller number, when in reality it doesn't, because there's 4 bolts and it gets your intelligence and your additive damage multipliers and all of that. But the damage number that you see here is a damage effect being applied over a much shorter period of time. Whereas Ultimate Shadow applies its damage over 4 seconds. That's why those damage numbers get so high. And Corpse Explosion is applying its damage over a whopping 6 seconds, drastically reducing the individual ticks per second that you end up doing with it. And we're just going to start with Shadow Bloodwave. So Shadow Bloodwave in the tooltip of the aspect shows this much damage. The thing that is kind of missing from here is that it is missing both your intelligence stat and then your additive damage stat as well. So that's why the damage number is going to be much higher than what you're seeing here. But Shadow Bloodwave, over 4 seconds, is expected to do this much damage per tick. The way that you get damage per tick is you take the base damage, and then you divide it by 2 times the number of seconds that's applied over, because it applies twice per second over 4 seconds. That's 8 ticks in total. And you expect to do damage per tick of 35,000. Now this ignores how much intelligence that you have, it ignores how much additive damage you have, it ignores all of the damage multipliers that we have. That's perfectly fine, but that's the number. Let's use this number kind of as a baseline. Now Corpse Explosion in our tooltip has this damage number applied to it. The issue here in comparing this one directly to this one is that this does take into account a bunch of different things that say they multiply how much damage you do as well as additive damage sources. The secondary problem here is that Corpse Explosion's tooltip does not properly scale with all the damage types that it should scale for. And I've made multiple videos covering these things in the past. But let's just look at this damage number where we go, okay, we have what the tooltip told us we do. It applies over 6 seconds. And then again, to figure out how much damage per tick, you take that damage divided by 6 times 2, that's 12 total ticks. And this is what you get as your base damage as a single Corpse Explosion. Now, multiplying that damage by Black River, right, which is supposed to be 100% plus 4 times my multiplier, which is a 128% multiplier, which is effectively just a 6.2 multiplier minus the little bit of difference that we have. And all of a sudden you start to get like this really big damage number, right? Obviously this damage number seems like it should be incredibly high. But again, this is if you're using the tooltip damage and then taking your expected damage and whatever. What if I were to add on my intelligence multiplier from the Shadow Bloodwave damage? Well, let's go ahead and look at what our total intelligence is. It is a 2.319. So we have 232 damage multiplier here. So let's go ahead and make this equal to 3.219, because it's 1 plus how much we get here. And all of a sudden, even ignoring all the additive damage that we have, the expected damage tick rate for Shadow Bloodwave gets much higher. And look, it's significantly higher than Black River. But Black River's damage was a whopping 50,000. The minimum damage on Shadow Bloodwave was a whopping 1.6 million. Okay, that's great. Let's look at Ebonpiercer's damage. Let's get an idea for what Ebonpiercer's damage should look like on paper, then what happens once you add on the other multipliers that it has. So if all you take is that same damage number that we had right here, the damage number from the tooltip, you get 29,418 damage. It is applied over 3 seconds. Now to figure out how much damage you're going to do, we're assuming that you're shotgunning all the blight bolts into targets. You corpse tendrils everything together. You walk right up to them. You cast blight. Also on bosses, you always shotgun on them. And what we get is 4 times the expected tick rate damage, because there are 4 bolts being applied to it. And you get a whopping 19,000 damage, which is significantly less than the damage of Black River. And even before we add on this multiplier from our intelligence and all of that, significantly less than Shadow Bloodwave. Okay, sure. Well, let's give it the same treatment that we would for Shadow Bloodwave. Let's take into account our intelligence multiplier. Let's take into account our additive damage multipliers as well. So for Shadow Bloodwave, in reality, we should have added on the intelligence multiplier and then our additive damage multiplier. Let's go ahead and do that. And we get a whopping almost 1 million damage per tick. That's much closer to what we were seeing in game, right? Keep in mind that monsters have damage reduction. We also have different multipliers from our Paragon boards and the Desecrated Glyph that gets you another 15% damage multiplier. That's why these damage numbers are generally lower. Let's go ahead and do that exact same thing over here onto Ebonpiercer. So let's add on the intelligence, which isn't shown in our tooltip, and our additive damage, which isn't shown in the tooltip either. And all of a sudden, the damage output from Ebonpiercer starts to get really, really big. Now keep in mind, the Corpse Explosion tooltip, although not completely accurate, is already including these types of damage multipliers onto it. If you increase your intelligence, you increase your additive damage, that number will go up. But just looking at the tooltip on an aspect, or just looking at the tooltip on a unique item, doesn't really give you a good idea of how much damage this is supposed to be doing. And Ebonpiercer, with the skill ranks from Blight, just provided from Shaco, is doing nearly 5 times as much damage as consuming 5 corpses with Black River. And oddly enough, you can spam Blight very fast, and generating 5 corpses every single time that you want to cast Corpse Explosion is a much harder task to accomplish, especially with a Black River and not with necessarily having a ton of lucky hit chance or not fighting a boss. So what does all of this boil down to? Well, it turns out that base skill damage just doesn't compete with the scaling flat damage effects in the game. And also, if your core skill isn't Bone Spirit that has a built-in 1,000 times damage multi, as well as huge damage multis from building into Essence that it already gets from its key passive, it gets kind of hard to be able to scale your damage in comparison to things like Minions, Bone Spirit, and Aspect and Unique flat values that have now increased with weapon damage much higher than your base skill damage has increased. All of that is to say, if you're confused right now, if you are having difficulty getting your build to scale, or if you're wondering why your favorite Bone Spirit build, or your favorite Sever build, or your favorite Bloodlance or Blood Surge build are ranked so low on max roll, or why they're not really competing in the upper echelons of the meta, it's because of this very thing. They just don't scale high enough. The Necromancer used to do very good damage, but it's because everything in the game had much less health and was much easier to stagger and was much easier to do damage to and survive that same damage. But now we're looking at the Pit, and the Pit has monsters that actually have a health total that is respectable and requires you to be able to output continuous DPS as opposed to DPS in these small burst windows. And on top of that, we'll just one-tap you once you get high enough up where the damage that they output can just outperform even our barrier gen or our damage reduction. So the fact that I just tossed together some gear today on Bloodwave, basically didn't have to change anything at all, and was clearing at the same tier that Sever was, but exceptionally faster and not failing and actually getting the reward at the end, whereas Sever was just barely getting over the finish line, and I'm only talking around like tier 80, tier 85. This is the reason. The skills for the Necromancer just can't scale at the rate that are required for the endgame content that currently exists in the game. Also, as a quick side note, because I know people are going to be confused because I've put out build guides talking about how good Blight is, like the build Blight, all of that is because of Ebonpiercer. I actually just want to show you very quickly. I'm going to take off Shaco as well. We're just going to drop Shaco. Blight, a 1 rank Blight, is doing 146,000 damage over 6 seconds. When I apply it to this target, is going to do a whopping 7,000. Oh, it crit for 23,000, but 7,000 to 23,000 damage, whether or not you hit a wither crit. That's just like the skill itself, but it's Ebonpiercer, oddly enough, that is doing all of the damage. It is actually bananas wild how much of the damage comes from the Ebonpiercer as opposed to the Blight itself. Blight ends up doing like 1/15 of the damage of the Ebonpiercer bolts, even though not everything in your skill tree and not everything that's available would actually scale them, and they would all scale Blight. Blight still is doing about 1/15 of the damage of the Ebonpiercer bolts, and I would not be surprised. I just wither crit there for 1,000,000 damage, as opposed to Blight itself, which does a whopping 17,000 to 32,000 damage. I just wanted to point that out very quickly because I know people were going to be confused. It's all the amulet. And here for Shadow Bloodwave, it's all the aspect. Basically, nothing else matters. But I want to put this video out there just to help people who were theory crafting and kind of smacking their heads against things and going like, why isn't this working? This is why it's not working. Our base skills just like can't scale for the damage in the game anymore. And I'd like to hear from you all and what your experience has been trying to play something that wasn't Bone Spirit or Minions or even Blight on the Necromancer this season. Have you been having success? Do you feel like you're easily doing tier 100, tier 120 on your build that isn't one of those things I just mentioned? Let me know down below. What secret sauce have you found? Or if you have been having these frustrations and you either dipped over to a different class or ended up just running minions like everybody else, let me know why you did that as well. Do you feel fulfilled? Do you think that something needs to be done here? Because I definitely do. I think that basically all the core skills and maybe the Necromancer skill tree in its entirety just needs a complete overhaul, because it's definitely basically one of the least interesting skill trees in the game. I went and played Sorceress for a couple of days, just like level it up during the event. And the amount of choices that I made on the Sorceress between individual skill nodes and individual passive nodes, et cetera, was a hilariously enjoyable experience. And coming back to the Necromancer just helped to put it into a perspective where I can really appreciate its lack of complexity. And while that simplicity can help a lot of people to enjoy it more, and I'm not poo-pooing that at all, I'd love to see something a little bit more interesting than just pick the color passives of your skill and pick the ultimate that your skill needs and add the damage to your skill. I'd definitely like to see a bit more. But let me know down in the comments what you think. If you're brand new here and you appreciate what you just saw, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a ton. Also toss a like onto it if you wouldn't mind doing that. As always, though, thank you so much for watching. I truly hope that this helped, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.